Shalom, everyone. I hope you had a good week so far. Anyway, I want to spend a little time talking to you about kosher, and in particular, what's wrong with eating a little bacon. That was the first thing that came to my mind. This is the toughest chapter for me because of the fact it doesn't technically apply, although I do apply it to myself. I haven't eaten a camel in a long time, and I probably won't. Although while I was in Africa, I did have the opportunity to watch the natives there bleed a camel. And after bleeding the camel, they took the blood and mixed it with milk, and they began to drink it. That was their super sauce. So that made it so I never wanted to do that again. But anyway, so we're going to talk about kosher foods. And I want to start by having you also turn with me to the book of Leviticus, to chapter 11. And we're going to start in the second verse of that chapter. God is talking to Moses. And it begins by saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the creatures that you may eat from among all the animals that are upon the earth. Everything among the animals that has a split hoof, which is completely separated into two hoofs, and that brings up its cud, that one you may eat. But this is what you shall not eat from among those that bring up their cud, or that have split hooves, the camel, for it brings up its cud, but its hoofs are not split. It's an unclean to you." Now the hyrax, which was the idea of a woodchuck, is my understanding, for it brings up the cud, but its hoof is not split. It is unclean to you. And the hare, for it brings up its cud, but it has no hoofs, no split foot, and is unclean to you. And the pig, for its hoof is split, and its hoof is completely separated, but it does not chew its cud. It is unclean to you. Last verse. You shall not eat of their flesh, nor shall you touch their carcasses. They are unclean to you. Now, the understanding here is the fact that God is very specific. He also limits the number of animals. Although he told you that you can eat meat from certain animals, you can't eat all of it. But I want you to look specifically at this whole section as though you were a Jew, that this was something you had to honor because it was one of God's laws. And from a Jewish point of view, for thousands of years, this has really been a discussion. I was reading prior to this week, which started me on this trail. I was reading about articles of groups of people within the Jewish community who have found it acceptable to eat pork. Pork is the one I most often think of when I think of kosher meats or unkosher. And they began by saying, well, you all know that the book of Leviticus was written to the priests and not to the general population, so therefore we can eat pork. Well, that sounds good, except for the fact that they missed a few things. And so when I go through understanding the fact that kosher meat is special and unkosher meat is special also. You know, they've been practicing kosher for 3,000 plus years. And so it's not something new. But at the same point in time, they seem to, as if they're thinking this is all for priests, they have this problem with this love thy neighbor section, which is in Leviticus chapter 19, when we get into Kudashim. Now, if you look at number 2, verse 2, it says, speak to the children of Israel. It doesn't say speak to the priests, but to speak to all of them. Now, at first, I thought, here's a problem. Only the Jews do not eat pork. But then I began to go back and look, and I found out the Phoenicians did not eat pork. I also found out those that live in the Arabian Peninsula did not eat pork. So I began to question, well, why didn't they? God didn't necessarily tell them, why didn't they eat the pork? Well, it came to me, or as an understanding, is the fact of the amount of water that's necessary in order to take care of pigs. And if you know the desert region well enough, you know there's not enough water to share, let alone to take and use your excess for the pork. And so these nations didn't practice kosher, but they didn't practice eating pork either. They simply abstained. I was reading another section which talked about what's called the coffin text. It's an Egyptian version of stories. And in this Egyptian version of stories, they talk about this evil god whose name was Set. Now, Set disguised himself as a black pig, and he began to move around. And remember, pigs are actually carnivorous. They do eat meat. In fact, they eat dead meat. Well, Osiris didn't like them. So Osiris, the god, killed Set and ended the pork. And so in Egypt, they don't eat pork either. And I kept going on and thinking about it. When I was in Israel, we were on a dig, but it was a Philistine dig. And there you could actually find the bones of pork, of pigs. So that made me wonder, what's going on? Well, then I began to go to Rambam. He was the first text that I went to. And Rambam says in his Guide to the Perplexed, he was trying to help those people that didn't understand or didn't realize what this was about. And so he had basically 4 reasons for this whole thing. The first reason he gave was the fact that the pig is actually most often very unhealthy. You know, it has this trichinosis. And they also have lots of other diseases that may be, or parasites that are attached to them. Also, when you look at where they live, how, well, unsanitary it is in the most part. And as I said, pigs are, well, they're omnivores. They eat anything, including dead bodies. They are no respecter of persons at all. And the final reason is the fact that in their digesting of the foods that they eat, toxins actually go quickly into their body because it goes right through their digestive system. There is no spitting up of the cud. It just simply goes through them. Well, after I looked at that, I went back and started looking other places. One of the places you should look is Rashi, because Rashi talks about it in the fact that he simply calls it a hoch. It's one of those laws that's a divine decree. There was no reason given by God. It's just what he wanted us to follow. And so he mentions it in the same breath as he would a red heifer or mixing linen and cotton. All those things that are linen and wool, by the way. Kabbalists, that was another group that I went looking for. They would add another prohibition to the fact that the animals were filthy. And what it did was it would lower your spirit, lower the way you treated yourself. You would become more animal-like. So by reducing the pork to a spiritual idea, many of them quit. Also, the Arizal was one of those that I went to in his guide to the gates. I found out that he began to look at them from the point of view of their soul. Some animals have a soul that can be elevated. Among them were cattle. Among them were the doves. Among them were the animals that would be offered in sacrifice. But there were those animals where no matter what you did, you could not elevate their soul. And therefore, you couldn't draw sparks from them, holiness from them. You could not elevate yourself by that. And so he told us not to eat a pork. Now, there are byproducts of pork that some of us do use. And I begin by asking the question, have you ever used gelatin? Gelatin is a substance, a dry powder that's mixed with water later. But how many knew that originally, for several years, the gelatin was made out of pork or cattle or fish. Basically, they took from the animal itself in the process of going through it, they took from its parts, they reduced this general idea to a gelatin that was dried powder. There is no taste, there is no color. Therefore, in Jewish understanding, it's kosher. And so Jews were able to get insulin, diabetic, because of that. Now, since then, they've come up with other ways of getting insulin. In fact, they're now working with bacteria and they're working with plants. Lots of different ways to come up with that. Now, Jewish law, food that has been finely processed so that it has no taste is considered not food at all. In fact, they call it parva. Parva has no flavor, has no taste, and therefore it's a substance that's permitted, even if it comes from an unkosher cow. But cows are kosher. So what does it leave us? As we go through understanding all of this, I came across a rabbi several hundred years past his prime. He lived in Seville, Spain, and his name was Rabbi Tom Yov, or Yom Tov. He was writing and looking at the Talmud, and he was in Kiddushin 49b. And he came to the conclusion that in the world to come, pork will become kosher. Now, he's written this in the 13th, 14th century. He understood this whole idea of being acceptable in the future. Well, what would make it acceptable? The understanding is something has changed. Has it changed physical shape? No. What has changed is what we begin to find out about our foods today. Burger King came up with the first hamburger with no meat. Well, that's not the only change that's coming to food. Among the changes that are coming is the idea of lab quality meat. Meat made from stem cells. Stem cells. We argued for years about stem cell research and the idea of taking them from babies. Remember those conversations a while ago? Well, stem cells are back again, but they're not from humans. They're from animals. Among them, pig. Now, there is a market group in Israel. It's called Supermeat. Supermeat is about to come to the conclusion successfully of manufacturing hamburger without a cow by using stem cells. Imagine how it's going to change the farming industry if you no longer have to kill an animal, spend all the money raising it, all the feed that would go into that, everything that would be about it. According to their understanding is they can do the same thing with the chicken. And I'm sure they're going to do the same thing with pork. Now, the idea is the fact that farm animals, if you took away the animals, you save about 99% of the materials that a farmer has to spend for. He doesn't have to worry about water because of the fact that there is no water necessary. So therefore, the farmer is using 90% less water. And also because of the methane gas that the animals pass, 96% of it disappears. Well on our way to becoming environmentally friendly, according to others. But it doesn't mean I have to eat vegetarian meals. It's understood that vegetarians actually are more depressed than meat eaters. Seems rather strange, but they found studies where they began to look at it. So someday, not too far off, you can imagine seeing a Jew in McDonald's eating a cheeseburger. Because you see, the meat will not be the meat that they would have gotten from an animal, but from a stem cell. Then you can mix dairy and meat that isn't and have a cheeseburger. Now, it sounds far-fetched, except for the fact in Israel today, there's this Rabbi Yuval Shirloff. He's from Israel. He's a part of the Zohar Rabbinical Organization. And he stated that lab-grown pork should be kosher, as it not really an actual pig, simply a few cultured pig stem cells, and contains no pig blood. It is the blood that holds the nephesh of the animal, and thereby there is no sparks to elevate. Now, it says in the Messianic age that you and I are going to go back to the days of Eden. Well, if we go back to the days of Eden, will be wonderful because there'll be no violence. But then we have to understand, if we go back to the days of Eden, they didn't eat meat. Adam and Eve were prohibited from eating meat. They ate the vegetation that was around them. Do you think Parva is going to be part of the world to come? Will we be able to eat whatever we want? Anything going to get in the way? Okay, enough of that. I want you to turn over again in Leviticus, and I want to talk about water. And so we're going to go back to 36th verse, I believe it is, 34, 11:34. (11:34) begins, of any food that is edible, upon which water comes, shall become contaminated, and any beverage that can be drunk in any vessel shall become contaminated. Anything upon which part of the carcass may fall shall be contaminated. An oven or a stove shall be smashed, and they are contaminated, and they shall remain contaminated to you. Verse 36, and this is the key. Only the spring or the cistern, which is the word cistern here is actually the word pit, and the gathering of water shall remain pure. But one who touches their carcasses shall become contaminated. In our story, I'm going to pull up, if you don't mind. Wait a second. Oh, I lost it. Forgive me while I look. Just talk among yourselves. Probably can't. Okay, where's it at? Opening up my files. And I'm going to look at Leviticus. Here it is. Now that's the kosher pig. Clean and unclean. Okay. View. How do I close it? Ross, talk me through putting this back on so I can see you.
We can see you. I can see everybody. Did you hit
You
share?
can see me?
Yes.
Okay, well then I'm fine then. I just wanted you to be able to see me, and that's the point behind this. So I'm going to open the slideshow. Come on. Reverse coach, hide slides from the beginning. Okay. I wanted to look at two particular scriptures. The first one comes in Leviticus 24 or 11:24. It says, and through these you shall become unclean. And what it talks about is touching dead bodies and touching things that have been contaminated. And you would be unclean until evening. But in verse 36, it picks up the idea, but a mime, which is a spring, and a bore, which is a cistern, and a mikveh, a gathering of water, remains clean. And however one touches their carcass shall be clean. Now, why is water clean? Well, I wanted to do some divine math, and actually I didn't do this on my own. Actually, I went to Rabbi Ginsburg, who is an expert in gematria. But I had to understand that there are three types of water, or water collectors. The first one is called ma'ain. Ma'ain is a spring. I gave you the spelling. I also tell you that it has a value when you add up the value of the letters, 160. A bore, which it calls a cistern, is a pit. Basically, it collects water. Its value is 208. And then a mikveh, which actually means a gathering of, and we'll talk more about that later, but a gathering of water is 151. Now, altogether, you total them up, you have the number 529. I did that on my own. What was added to it is the fact that he's mathematically figured out that what I'm talking about is something called 23 squared. Another word with the same gematria as 529 is the word ta'anug, which means pleasure. So why does water purify? Because it represents and symbolizes divine pleasure. Now, the sign of impurity is the opposite of pleasure. It's about sorrow and hardship and anxiety and depression. And in a Jewish ritual, the body of a person must enter the body of a pure water and immerse or cover themselves completely with the water. You can't do it in a bathtub. It has to be water that has drained to that particular place. A river would work because it's flowing water. Now, the whole thing is about this is inherent pleasure or pure water that purifies the body from its impurities. And to touch one of those carcasses caused impurity. Some more help. Now, if you take the 7 words that comprise that sentence, and I listed them for you, we have 7 words, 25 letters. Now, combining all those letters together, you have a total of 896. Now we have what is known as the second aspect of an unknowable head, the Keter. If you go through the understanding of the 10 Sephirot, Keter is that unknowable head. That's the top. The first part of the top of your head is dealing with pleasure, creating pleasure. But there's also something else involved in that 896, and that's the idea of temumut, sincerity, simplicity, earnestness. That's the second part of your unknowable. Now, if you take the 7 words that comprise this sentence, we have 7 words, 25 letters that combine to that 8. So I guess I wrote that sentence twice, didn't I? Now I said earlier that we had 25, which is 5 squared. And in Hebrew, it is acceptable to take those 25 letters and build for myself a square that's exactly in the order. And so I did. I began with the first letter, which was an aleph. Went to the next, which a resh, mem, ein, yud. That's my top line. Now, as you take a look at those letters, look at the 4 corners. You see, this is the third part of that unknowable head. The word that's there is yireh, which means fear. Now we have the 3 experiences that are alluded to by the phrase of the 3 bodies of water. The value of the 3 words, 896, or another word, temumot, which is the idea of 896, which is the idea of earnesty. The property of water speaks of divine pleasure, which comes from some from the study of the Torah, or doing a mitzvot according to the rabbis. Now, lastly, we are called upon to worship Hashem in fear, awe. Okay, so what does the Torah have to list 3 different types of bodies of water? Now, when we first looked at the 3 bodies, we did not say mime with each of the 3, but that's understood. The word mime should already be referred to because of this fact of dealing with water. Now, these 3 refer to the 2 triplets of water. You see, there's not only those triplets, but there's also the triplet called wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Water has spiritual power. I was reading another book, which I have in my possession, and the book comes from, excuse me for a second while I reach back. The book is called Waters of Eden. It was written by Ari Kaplan many years ago, but I've been reading it over and over again. I started reading it in the first place because I went with my son to his church. He doesn't go there anymore, but the church that we went to was what I would call very liberal. It was more of a social club. The pastor was gone and the associate was there, and a fella came home from Baylor or Texas A&M, one of the two, and he came home for the purposes of being baptized, which I thought was rather interesting. But the problem was the pastor didn't know why people are baptized. He had no understanding of water, nor understanding of the systems that were there. And he was talking from a Christian perspective. Well, after it was all done, I wrote my son a note. Well, it wasn't actually a note, it was 5 pages, in which I explained to my son what I understood about the baptism. And that was when I was still practicing Christianity. Since then, I've become a little different in my understanding. We need to understand that everything in this physical world has a spiritual counterpart. Water is more than a liquid. It's the symbol of spiritual cleansing. Remember early on in Genesis 1:2, we learned that the story of the earth was formless and chaotic, with darkness upon the face of the deep, while God's Spirit was hovering over the face of this water. In fact, the text does not tell us everything. There is much that we needed to discover on our own. First off, the text does not share with us how, when, and how water was created. We just see that it was there. Torah is concerned with spiritual man and with teaching us how the world relates to man with respect to God. Most Hebrew scholars see that the water found in those first verses speaks less of water and more of the idea of fluidity. You see, in the beginning, the universe was a state of fluidity. Before creation, change never occurred. God dwelled in a world above this world. Remember in Malachi 3:6, he says, I am God, I change not. Now, one of the first things that I had happened to me was God inserting change into this world. This new world was going to be a dynamic, fluid world. But pure change only results in chaos. And that is how the Bible describes the early beginnings. The earth was formless, fluid, and it was void, chaotic, tohu vabohu. It was out of this chaos that good and evil actually came into being, which we find hinted in the very next verse. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. This darkness was not simply physical, but it was spiritual also. Now, the wind was moving over the surface of the water, but has little or no effect on God's Spirit moving. You see, this verse of moving over the water is hinted at in the Hebrew with the word mechashef, which happens to be the same word that's used for a helicopter in Israel, which here connotes the idea of caring for. So when God is passing over the water, he is caring for. Now, I also need to understand that this is in the present tense, indicating that this moving over this water is still happening. He is providing guidance and is consistent and continuous to this very day. I want you to follow the sequence a little bit. On day one, he ends by saying, "Let there be light," and there was light. Only at the point could spiritual enlightenment be brought into being. The Midrash teaches that the Spirit of God that is or was hovering over the waters was actually the Messiah. Now, in the Messianic age, that represents the final fulfillment of God's purpose for all of this creation. Now, on the second day, we learned that God separated the waters, creating water above and water below, symbolizing that these waters represent, in their understanding, male and female. Now, we saw the beginnings of this in the first letter of the Bible when it says Bet. Bet is two. From the very beginning, he began to develop two. We call them male and female. Now, with the creation of this idea of male and female, God established in the pair the ability to produce children. Now, the idea of change at that point was not something haphazard. Ultimately, every concept would reflect a male-female relationship. Now, on the third day, God gathered the waters. And where it says it gathered the waters, that's the word mikvah. And God created a mikvah under the heavens in one place. And at the same time, he established land. And into the world of change and fluidity, God established a solid substance, something permanent. This in turn allowed the plants and the existence of life, which began to occur on that day also. It is here that we find the phrase mikvah mayim, gathering of water. Okay. We need to talk about waters as it relates to the waters of Eden. The waters of Eden bring together a number of ideas. First, these waters represented the womb of humanity, because remember, everything has been gathered. And since it was these waters, God formed man from the dust. So he formed ground, or he allowed ground to be seen, and then he had the water to mix with the dust to create man. Now, these waters were the source of 4 rivers, which gave man the ability to reconnect to his ultimate source, even in his fallen state. Remember when Adam sinned, he spent years sitting at the headwaters of one of those rivers, trying to get back in, but the cherubs would not allow him in. Now, it allowed man to grow towards God. And finally, these waters represent the change in the flow towards God's goal. You see, the world is going, whether we believe it or not, towards God. Now, when a person immerses himself in a mikvah, they are also immersing themselves in change itself. Because you see, there is such a thing, or is there such a thing as an unpardonable sin? Christianity tells there is. Judaism doesn't. You already know that water is fluid, but water is the primary representative of a fluid state, and water is the spiritual equivalent of fluency. Water equals spiritual cleansing. Our ego depends on the element of permanence, while water speaks of change and fluidity. And when we are totally immersed, our ego is nullified and we become open to change. That's what the dipping is. Emerging from the water, we enter a total state of renewal. In the mikveh, and more specifically the water, the true repentance can wash away any sin. There is no such thing as an unpardonable sin. The Talmud says that nothing can stand before repentance. Understand that change is possible. It's been built into the world from the very beginning. At this point in time, hopefully I can get out of this. Maybe I can't. I did. Close. I can save it. Close. Hopefully you could hear me and understand what I'm talking about. My point behind this all is God has a law for kosher, but God also has a law for change, the preparations, the moving towards. Our world doesn't look like it's moving any closer to God than it did 10 years ago. In fact, if I were to make a good estimate right now, I would think most of you would agree that we're going to hell in a handbasket. But we have to understand whatever we think is going on isn't going on, because God is in control. And he's in control every time I think about water. And I think about the change that comes about because of water. I drink water to maintain my system. There's going to come a day when I will die, which is the natural part and process. But in death, what happens? The water, the change element in me, will disappear. And all that will be left will be permanence. That's all that's left. God built a world with water and spiritual contact. Water nourishes my soul. The Torah is water. It's there for nourishment also. Okay, I covered two subjects tonight at the same time, and hopefully you got something out of it. If you have any thoughts, I'd appreciate hearing from you. If you have another question on any other part of the Parsha, I'd be glad to talk to you about that too. It's not that I haven't read the Parsha, it's just that those were things that were burning in me and I kept working on it. So I was telling my friends on Sunday, I was already going to talk about bacon on Wednesday night and how bacon's going to be something I can eat sooner or later, but I probably won't because I don't like bacon. But anyway, back to the story. Anybody, thoughts?